Summer 1945, when American guards served grilled corn to newly captured German women POWs in a Texas camp, the prisoners erupted in mocking laughter. Das ist Tierfutter. That's animal food. Convinced it proved everything the Reich had told them about inferior, uncultured Americans. But within months, that same despised corn would trigger an ideological collapse, so devastating that some of these women could never return to the beliefs they'd held their entire lives. What did they discover in American captivity that shattered 12 years of Nazi indoctrination? And what happened when they finally returned home, carrying the truth their starving families weren't ready to hear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Summer 1945, Germany was dying. For 12 long years, the German people had listened to their leaders tell them they were the greatest nation on earth. They were told they would rule the world. They were told their enemies were weak and stupid. But now the cities were piles of broken stone. The factories were silent. The streets were filled with dust and ash from bombs that fell every night. People stood in long lines for tiny pieces of bread. A mother might get one egg to feed her whole family for a week. Children with thin faces and hollow eyes dug through garbage, looking for potato peels. The average German was living on less than 1,500 calories each day. That was barely enough to survive. The women worked now because the men were gone. Millions of German soldiers were dead or captured, or still fighting battles they could not win. So women ran the factories. They built weapons and bullets and shells. They kept the war machine running, even as everything around them fell apart. They had been taught since they were little girls that Germany was special. In school, their teachers told them that German people were better than everyone else. They learned that Americans were lazy and mixed up with different races. They were told America had no real culture, no real strength, no real future. The German Reich would last 1,000 years, the leaders promised. America would fall apart in a generation. Helga was 24 years old. She came from Hamburg, a city that used to shine with lights and music and ships coming into the harbor. Now Hamburg was a graveyard of twisted metal and burned buildings. She had worked in a factory making parts for airplanes. Her hands were rough and scarred from the machines. She had not seen her parents in 2 years. She did not know if they were alive. Greta was only 19. She was pretty with blonde hair pulled back tight. She believed everything the Reich had taught her. Her father was an important member of the Nazi Party. She had spent her teenage years in the League of German Girls, marching and singing songs about the fatherland. She wore her pride like armor. Even now, even as everything crumbled, she held her chin high. Germany would rise again, she told herself. They just had to believe. Lot was 32 and tired in her bones. She had 2 children back home with her mother. Her husband was missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. She worked making bullets in a munitions factory because she had no choice. She did what she was told and tried not to think too much. Thinking hurt worse than hunger. The 3 women had been captured in the final chaotic days of the war. They were auxiliary workers, not soldiers, but the Americans took them prisoner anyway. They were loaded onto trucks with dozens of other women. They expected the worst. The propaganda had told them that American soldiers were cruel. They would be starved, maybe killed. This is what happened to enemies of the Reich. But the truck ride was smooth. Too smooth. The roads had no holes from bombs. When they crossed into American-held territory, Helga looked out and gasped. The fields were green and perfect. Crops grew in long, neat rows. Cows grazed on hills that had never seen war. Houses stood complete with glass in every window. There were no ruins, no craters, no burned trees. It looked like a postcard, like something from a dream. The camp sat in rural Texas under a blazing summer sun. The sky stretched forever, bigger than any sky in Germany. The buildings were new and clean. Fences marked the boundaries, but inside the camp there were barracks with real beds and screens on the windows to keep out bugs. The women shuffled off the trucks, confused and frightened. Where were the torture rooms? Where were the tiny cells and chains? That first evening, they were brought to the mess hall. The building was huge and bright with electric lights that did not flicker. Long tables filled the room. American guards, both men and women, stood along the walls. They did not look mean. They looked bored, like this was just another day at work. The German women sat down, expecting a bowl of thin soup, maybe a crust of bread. That was more than they had eaten in months back home. What came instead made them freeze. Large trays appeared loaded with food. Real food. There was meat, actual meat, thick and steaming. There were potatoes with butter melting on top. There was white bread, soft and fresh. There were vegetables, green beans and carrots. There was so much food that it piled high on the plates. Some women started crying. Others just stared. Greta looked angry, like this was some kind of trick. Then the American guard brought out the corn. Golden yellow ears of corn, grilled and hot, with butter dripping down the sides. He placed them on the table, one ear in front of each prisoner. The German women looked at the corn. They looked at each other. Then someone started to laugh. It was a harsh sound, full of shock and scorn. Another woman joined in. Soon half the table was laughing, pointing at the corn. Das ist Tierfutter. Greta said loudly, her voice sharp with disgust. That is animal food. The other women nodded and laughed harder. In Germany, corn was what you fed to pigs and cows. Only the poorest of the poor, only people with no other choice, would eat corn. And here the Americans were serving it like it was a feast. This proved everything they had been told. Americans really were uncivilized. They really did not understand culture or proper food. The laughter spread through the mess hall, bitter and mocking. The American guards looked confused. One young soldier shrugged and bit into his own ear of corn, chewing happily. He did not seem insulted. He just seemed puzzled by their reaction. Helga stared at the corn on her plate. Her stomach ached with hunger. The smell rising from it was sweet and rich. But everyone was laughing. How could she eat animal food? What would that say about her? The laughter died down, but the corn stayed on their plates. Greta pushed hers to the side with one finger, like it might bite her. She would not eat animal food. She was German. She had standards. But Helga kept looking at her ear of corn. Steam still rose from it. The butter glistened in the electric light. Her mouth watered. Her stomach twisted and growled. Back home, she had not eaten butter in over a year. Back home, any food at all was a gift from God. She picked up the corn with both hands. The heat felt good against her palms. She brought it close to her face and smelled it. Sweet, rich, nothing like the moldy bread and watery cabbage soup she had lived on for months. She glanced around the table. Some women were eating the meat and potatoes but avoiding the corn. Greta was staring at her with cold blue eyes, judging. Helga did not care anymore. She bit into the corn. The taste exploded in her mouth. It was sweet like candy, but also buttery and warm. The kernels popped between her teeth, releasing flavor she had forgotten food could have. Her eyes went wide. She took another bite, then another. This was not animal food. This was wonderful. This was better than anything she had eaten in years. She looked up and saw Lot watching her. Lot's eyes were hungry and curious. Slowly, Lot picked up her own corn and tried a small bite. Her face changed. She nodded and kept eating. Within minutes, most of the women at the table were eating their corn. Only Greta and a few others refused, sitting with crossed arms and tight mouths. But even Greta kept glancing at the empty cobs piling up, at the satisfied looks on the other women's faces. A seed of doubt had been planted, small but growing. The days that followed brought more shocks. Every morning, the women received fresh milk with breakfast. Not the gray powdered stuff mixed with water. Real milk, cold and white and creamy. There was butter for the bread every single day. There was real coffee, dark and strong, not the fake coffee made from acorns and grain that they drank back home. On Sunday, the guards brought out ice cream. Helga had not seen ice cream since before the war started in 1939. Some of the younger women had never tasted it at all. They ate slowly, closing their eyes, trying to make it last forever. The women were assigned work duties around the camp. Helga and Lot were sent to help in the main kitchen. When they walked through the door, they stopped and stared. The kitchen was bigger than most houses. Huge steel refrigerators hummed along one wall, keeping food cold and fresh. There were 6 massive gas stoves with blue flames that turned on and off with the twist of a knob. No wood to chop. No fire to tend. Just instant heat whenever you needed it. Sacks of flour and sugar sat stacked to the ceiling. Crates of fresh vegetables arrived every other day. Whole sides of beef hung in the cold room. The American cooks worked quickly and easily, never worried about running out of anything. Lot whispered to Helga while they peeled potatoes. If this is how they treat prisoners, what did they tell us about America? Her voice shook a little. Helga did not answer, but the question echoed in her head for days. More proof came in small moments. One afternoon, 3 American women guards arrived for their shift. They parked their cars in front of the administration building. Their own cars. Each woman owned her own car. In Germany, only the richest people, only party officials and factory owners, had cars. These were regular working women, guards at a prison camp, and they drove their own automobiles to work like it was nothing special. The German prisoners watched through the fence, silent and stunned. A week later, a bright red Coca-Cola truck pulled up to the camp. The driver unloaded crate after crate of glass bottles filled with dark fizzing liquid. At dinner, each prisoner received a bottle. Helga held hers up to the light. She had heard of Coca-Cola from the propaganda. It was supposed to be a symbol of American excess and waste. She opened it and took a sip. The bubbles tickled her nose. It was sweet and sharp and cold. It was delicious. And they were giving it away for free to prisoners. She thought about her mother back in Hamburg, digging through ruins looking for food. She thought about her little brother who died last winter from hunger and cold. The bottle in her hand suddenly felt heavy. On Saturday night, the camp showed a film in the recreation hall. It was an American movie with bright colors and music. The prisoners saw huge cities with buildings that touched the sky. They saw highways with 6 lanes of traffic. They saw factories producing cars by the thousands. They saw regular families living in houses with refrigerators and electric washing machines and multiple bedrooms. Greta stood up and walked out halfway through. "Propaganda," she muttered. "Lies to break our spirits." But the other women stayed and watched, and some of them cried quietly in the dark. Letters arrived from home. Helga got one from her aunt. The words were short and careful because censors read everything. But the meaning was clear. Hamburg was starving. The Russian soldiers were everywhere in the east. Nobody knew what would happen next. Lot received word that her mother and children were alive but living in a basement because their house was destroyed. They were eating grass soup and feeling lucky to have it. The women read their letters and then looked around at the camp, at the full plates and clean beds and electric lights. The distance between here and home felt bigger than any ocean. By the 3rd week, even Greta was eating corn. She did it quietly when she thought no one was watching. But Helga saw. Everyone saw. The corn appeared at almost every meal now, sometimes grilled, sometimes boiled, sometimes mixed with butter and salt. It stopped being a joke. It became normal. It became good. The women began to understand that what they called animal food was really just abundance. America grew so much corn, they could eat it themselves instead of only feeding it to livestock. That was not poverty pretending to be culture. That was wealth so deep they could not measure it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. November came and the Texas air turned cool at night. The German women had been in the camp for 4 months now. They worked and ate and slept in their clean barracks. They wrote careful letters home and received sad letters back. The gap between their two worlds grew wider every day. Helga no longer felt like the same person who had arrived laughing at corn. Something inside her had shifted, like a house settling on a cracked foundation. She did not talk about it, but she felt it every morning when she woke to the smell of fresh coffee instead of air raid sirens. On the 4th Thursday of November, the camp commander made an announcement. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving, an American holiday. The prisoners would be invited to join the American staff for a special meal. Some of the German women were suspicious. Was this a trick? A test? Greta said it was probably more propaganda, a show they could photograph and use to make themselves look kind. But most of the women were simply curious. They had never been invited to anything before. They had only ever been ordered or commanded or forced. The mess hall was decorated with orange and yellow paper leaves and strange bird shapes made from folded paper. The Americans called them turkeys. Long tables were pushed together and covered with white cloth. The German women filed in quietly, unsure where to sit or what to do. American soldiers and guards smiled and waved them over. "Sit anywhere," a young sergeant said. "You're our guests today." Guests. The word sounded strange. They were prisoners. How could they be guests? The food arrived on huge platters carried by American cooks and volunteers from a nearby town. Helga saw whole roasted turkeys, bigger than any bird she had seen. There were bowls of mashed potatoes like white clouds. There were green beans with bits of bacon. There were rolls so soft and golden they seemed to glow. There were sweet potatoes covered in something brown and sticky. There was a red sauce made from berries. And yes, there was corn. Mountains of corn, buttered and seasoned, served in big bowls like it was treasure. Greta sat next to Helga, her face carefully blank. She had barely spoken to anyone in days. Her letters from home had stopped coming. Nobody knew if that was good news or terrible news. An American woman sat down across from them. She was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and kind wrinkles around her eyes. She wore a simple dress, not a uniform. "I'm Margaret," she said in slow, careful German. "My husband is the chaplain here. I wanted to meet you and share this meal." The chaplain's wife passed the dishes around, making sure everyone took plenty. She talked while they ate, asking gentle questions about where they came from, if they had family, what they did before the war. She did not ask about Hitler or the Nazis or why Germany did what it did. She just talked to them like they were people, like they mattered. After the main meal, she pulled out a small photo album from her purse. "These are my children," she said, showing pictures of 3 grown sons. This one was fought in France. This one was in the Pacific. This one worked in a factory making airplanes. She pointed to each photo with a soft smile. "We were so worried. But they all came home safe. We are very blessed." Helga stared at the photos. These sons had fought against Germany. They had dropped bombs on German cities. They had killed German soldiers. And now their mother was sitting here sharing her Thanksgiving meal with German prisoners, showing them family pictures like they were neighbors. Helga's throat went tight. This did not make sense. Winners were supposed to hate the losers. Conquerors were supposed to grind the defeated into the dirt. That was what she had been taught. That was what Germany had planned to do to everyone else. Greta's hand started shaking. She put down her fork. Her lips trembled. Then tears spilled down her cheeks, fast and hot. She covered her face with both hands, but could not stop the sobs that came from deep in her chest. "They have so much," she choked out in German. "They have so much, and they are still kind. How? How can they be kind?" Margaret did not understand the words, but she understood the crying. She reached across the table and took Greta's hand, holding it gently until the sobbing slowed. That night, Helga could not sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the dark ceiling. Her mind raced in circles, chasing thoughts she had been afraid to think for weeks. She remembered her teachers telling her that America was weak because the people were mixed, because they came from everywhere, because they let everyone vote and argue and disagree. "Democracy made you soft," the teachers said. "Only strong leaders and pure blood made a nation powerful." But that was backwards. That was completely backwards. America's mixing, its freedom, its loudness and messinesses, that was exactly what made it strong. These people did not need one leader to tell them what to think. They figured things out together. They built things together. And they had so much because they worked together, not because they forced everyone to march in the same direction. In the bunk below, Lot whispered up to her. "Are you awake?" Helga said yes. Lot was quiet for a moment, then spoke slowly. "My whole life, they told us we were the best, the strongest, the most advanced, the master race." She said that last part with bitter poison in her voice. But we were the ones starving. We were the ones living in ruins. We were the ones who destroyed ourselves. They called it superiority, but it was just propaganda covering up how desperate we really were. 2 bunks over, Greta was writing in a small notebook by flashlight. Helga could see her hand moving fast across the page, like if she did not get the words out, they would burn her from the inside. Later, Helga would read what Greta wrote that night. Everything was a lie. The Americans did not starve. They were not inferior. We were the ones who were starving. We were the ones destroyed. How could we have been so wrong about everything? I think about that corn on the first night. We laughed and called it animal food. We thought it proved they were beneath us. But we were the ones who were animals, tearing each other apart over scraps while they lived in peace and plenty. My father told me Germany would rule for 1,000 years. We did not last 12. And these people we were supposed to conquer, they are feeding us better than our own leaders ever did. The next morning at breakfast, corn appeared on the table again. Nobody laughed. Nobody made jokes. They ate it quietly, tasting it differently now. It was not just food anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had misunderstood. Europeans had turned up their noses at corn because they were too poor to eat it any other way except as animal feed. They had made poverty into culture, scarcity into refinement. But America had so much corn they could eat it themselves, fresh and sweet and abundant. Their casual attitude toward food was not vulgarity. It was wealth so deep and wide, they could not even see the bottom of it. Helga ate her corn slowly, each bite tasting like truth. Spring 1946, the ship that carried them back to Germany moved slowly across the gray Atlantic. Helga stood on the deck with her small bag of belongings clutched in both hands. Inside were things she had saved from her time in Texas, a few American recipes written on scraps of paper, a photograph of Margaret, the chaplain's wife, who had hugged her goodbye, a small English dictionary she had traded for, and buried at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, 3 kernels of dried corn she had kept from that first night. She did not know why she saved them. Maybe as proof, maybe as a reminder, maybe because she needed something solid to hold on to when the world stopped making sense. The other women on the ship were quiet. They had spent months in American captivity, being fed and treated well. Now they were going home to a country that had lost everything. Some were excited to see family. Others were terrified of what they would find. Greta stood at the rail looking out at the water. Her face had changed. The hard pride was gone. She looked older now and sadder, and somehow more real. She and Helga had become friends in those final months. They studied English together. They talked late into the night about what they would do when they got home. Greta wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to teach children to think for themselves, to question what they were told, to never follow blindly again. Lot stood with them, silent and worried. Her children would be 7 and 5 now. Would they remember her? Would her husband ever come back from wherever he was lost? She carried a bag of hard candy she had saved from the camp, 1 piece for each child. It was all she had to give them. The ship docked in Bremen. The port was a nightmare of broken concrete and twisted metal. Cranes lay on their sides like dead giants. Buildings that once held offices and shops were now hollow shells with empty windows staring like blind eyes. The women walked down the gangway into a Germany they barely recognized. The air smelled of dust and mold and something rotten underneath. Everywhere they looked, they saw destruction. Mountains of rubble lined the streets. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and gray and silent. Children with stick arms and swollen bellies sat on piles of broken bricks. Old women dug through trash heaps looking for anything useful. Anything at all. Helga took a train toward Hamburg. The train was slow and crowded and stopped often because the tracks were damaged. Through the windows, she saw the same scene repeated in every town and city. Nothing was whole. Nothing was clean. Everything was broken and starving. She thought about the mess hall in Texas, about the overflowing plates and the ice cream on Sundays. She thought about the Coca-Cola truck and the American women driving their own cars to work. The distance between there and here was not just miles across an ocean. It was the distance between 2 different universes. Hamburg was worse than she imagined. Her neighborhood was gone. Just gone. Where her family's apartment building once stood, there was a crater filled with broken stones and burned wood. She asked neighbors who lived in the basement of a partially standing building nearby. They told her most of her family had died in the firebombing of 1943. Her mother was alive, living with Helga's aunt on the other side of the city in a building that still had 3 walls and part of a roof. Helga found her mother. The old woman did not recognize her at first. Helga had gained weight in America. Her face was fuller. Her skin had color. She looked healthy in a city where everyone looked half dead. Her mother grabbed her and held her and cried into her shoulder. "We thought you were gone forever," her mother whispered. "We thought we would never see you again." That first night, they had dinner together. Helga's aunt and mother had saved up rations for a week to make a special meal for her homecoming. They boiled potatoes in water with a tiny bit of salt. They had 1 small piece of hard bread to share between the 3 of them. They drank hot water with a few leaves of mint in it, pretending it was tea. This was a feast by Hamburg standards in 1946. This was them, celebrating. Helga looked at the watery potatoes and felt sick. She remembered the Thanksgiving turkey. She remembered the bowls of corn and the soft rolls and the butter and the pie. She felt guilty for every meal she had eaten in Texas, guilty for being full while her family starved, guilty for being healthy while they faded away. But underneath the guilt was something else: anger, rage. Her leaders had promised them glory and given them destruction. They had promised them a 1,000-year Reich and delivered 12 years of horror ending in total collapse. They had told her America was weak and inferior while Americans lived in peace and plenty. The lies had cost everything. The lies had killed millions. The lies had destroyed her entire country. Her mother and aunt asked about her time as a prisoner. They asked carefully, afraid of what she might have suffered. Helga tried to explain. She tried to tell them about the abundance, about the kindness, about how the Americans had fed them better than the German government ever had. But her words came out wrong. Her mother's face closed up. Her aunt looked away, At least you were fed, her aunt said quietly, and the words carried sharp edges. At least you had a roof and a bed. We were here in the bombing. We were here when the city burned. We watched children starve in the streets. Helga stopped talking. She could not make them understand. If she told them the truth, that she had eaten well and slept safely and even celebrated Thanksgiving with the enemy, they would think she was bragging. They would think she did not care about their suffering. There was no way to explain that her time in Texas had not been punishment. It had been education. It had taught her everything the Reich had hidden from them. She unpacked her small bag that night in the cold room they shared. She took out the recipes she had written down. Her mother looked at them with confused eyes. Apple pie, Helga explained. And something called cornbread. Her mother did not ask what cornbread was. There was no corn in Hamburg. There was barely any bread. These recipes were useless here, dreams from another world. But Helga kept them anyway. She also kept studying English using her small dictionary. Her mother thought she was crazy. Why learn the language of our enemy? She asked. Helga did not say that she was learning the language of her future. She did not say that she had already decided she would leave Germany as soon as she could save enough money. She would go back to America. She would find a way. Greta went home to her family in Munich. Her father had survived by pretending he was never really a Nazi party member. He burned all his uniforms and photographs and documents. He told new stories about how he had secretly disagreed with Hitler all along. Greta sat at dinner with him and listened to his lies and felt nothing but cold contempt. She saw through everything now. When he asked about her time in the prison camp, she told him the truth. She told him about the food and the kindness and the Thanksgiving dinner. She told him that everything the Reich had taught them was backwards and wrong. Her father's face turned red. He shouted that she had been brainwashed by American propaganda. Greta stood up from the table and walked out. She moved in with a friend and got a job teaching at a school for young children. She never spoke to her father again. Lot found her children living with her mother in a basement room in Berlin. Her husband never came home. He was listed as missing, which meant he was dead somewhere in Russia or Poland, buried in an unmarked grave or left to rot in a field. Her children were alive but damaged. They flinched at loud noises. They hoarded food under their mattresses. They had forgotten how to play. Lot gave them the candy she had saved and held them while they cried. She started teaching them English words in the evenings. Her mother asked why. Because the world is bigger than what we were told, Lot said. Because I want them to know there are other ways to live. Her children learned quickly. They were hungry for something beyond the gray ruins and the endless hunger. Years passed. Germany slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes. The Marshall Plan brought American money and American help. The economy began to recover. People started to eat regularly again. The rubble was cleared away and new buildings rose. But the country that emerged was different from the one that had started the war. It was smaller, divided, haunted by what it had done. Helga saved every penny she earned working as a translator. In 1952, she had enough money for a ticket to America. She said goodbye to her mother at the train station. I do not understand why you want to leave, her mother said. Germany is your home. Helga hugged her tight. Germany is where I was born, she said. But America is where I learned to think freely. That is the home I need now. She sailed across the Atlantic again, this time heading the other direction. This time toward a future instead of away from a past. She settled in Ohio and got a job in a factory. Later she married an American man and had 3 children. She taught them to appreciate everything they had. She told them stories about the war, about hunger, about the lies. And she told them about the corn. About how she and the other prisoners had laughed at it and called it animal food. About how wrong they had been. Greta stayed in Germany and taught school for 40 years. She never married. She never had children of her own. But she shaped hundreds of young minds, teaching them to question authority, to think critically, and to never blindly follow a leader who promised easy answers. She kept a journal from her time in Texas. Sometimes she read from it to her older students. They needed to know what happened when a whole nation stopped thinking for itself. Lot raised her children to be kind and skeptical and brave. Her son became a doctor. Her daughter became a journalist. Both of them traveled the world. Both of them understood that their mother's time in an American prison camp had saved her life and changed her soul. It had given her a gift of perspective that she passed down to them like an inheritance. In 1995, Helga was 74 years old and living in a quiet suburb of Cleveland. Her grandchildren came to visit. They were making a video project for school about World War II. They asked her to tell them about her experiences. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. "We laughed at their corn and called it animal food," she said. "But we were the hungry animals, starved not just for food but for truth. That corn, that strange American abundance, it did not just feed our bodies. It cracked open our minds. We learned that everything the Reich told us was backwards. The people we thought were inferior had treated us better than our own leaders ever did. They gave us full plates when we expected empty bowls. They gave us kindness when we expected cruelty. And in doing that, they showed us what real strength looks like. It is not about conquering others. It is about having so much that you can afford to be generous, even to your enemies." She paused and looked out the window at her garden where corn grew tall in the summer sun. Sometimes it takes eating your enemy's animal food to realize you have been on the wrong side all along. That is what I learned in Texas. That is what changed my life. And that is why I came back here, to this country, as soon as I could. Because I wanted to live in a place where abundance makes people kind instead of cruel. Where strength comes from freedom, not from force. The corn taught me that. A simple ear of corn. Her grandchildren listened with wide eyes. Later, when they ate dinner, there was corn on the table. Fresh sweet corn, buttered and salted. Helga ate it slowly, tasting everything it meant. Everything it had taught her. Everything it still represented after 50 years. It was just corn. But it was also the moment her world turned upside down and finally landed right side up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.